Section 1 of Options. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Options by O. Henry. The Rose of Dixie. When the Rose of Dixie magazine was started by a stock company in Toombs City, Georgia, there was never but one candidate for its chief editorial position in the minds of its owners. Colonel Aquila Telfair was the man for the place. By all the rights of learning, family, reputation, and Southern traditions, he was its foreordained, fit, and logical editor. So a committee of the patriotic Georgia citizens, who had subscribed the founding fund of $100,000, called upon Colonel Telfair at his residence, Cedar Heights, fearful lest the enterprise and the South should suffer by his possible refusal. The colonel received them in his great library, where he spent most of his days. The library had descended to him from his father. It contained 10,000 volumes, some of which had been published as late as the year 1861. When the deputation arrived, Colonel Telfair was seated at his massive white pine center table, reading Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. He arose and shook hands punctiliously with each member of the committee. If you were familiar with The Rose of Dixie, you will remember the colonel's portrait, which appeared in it from time to time. You could not forget the long, carefully brushed white hair, the hooked, high-bridged nose, slightly twisted to the left, the keen eyes under the still black eyebrows, the classic mouth beneath the drooping white mustache, slightly frazzled at the ends. The committee solicitously offered him the position of managing editor, humbly presenting an outline of the field that the publication was designed to cover, and mentioning a comfortable salary. The colonel's lands were growing poorer each year, and were much cut up by red gullies. Besides, the honor was not one to be refused. In a 40-minute speech of acceptance, Colonel Telfair gave an outline of English literature from Chaucer to Macaulay, refought the Battle of Chancellorsville, and said that, God helping him, he would so conduct The Rose of Dixie that its fragrance and beauty would permeate the entire world, hurling back into the teeth of the northern minions their belief that no genius or good could exist in the brains and hearts of the people whose property they had destroyed and whose rights they had curtailed. Offices for the magazine were partitioned off and furnished in the second floor of the First National Bank building, and it was for the colonel to cause the Rose of Dixie to blossom and flourish, or to wilt in the balmy air of the land of flowers. The staff of assistants and contributors that editor Colonel Telfair drew about him was a peach. It was a whole crate of Georgia peaches. The first assistant editor, Tolliver Lee Fairfax, had had a father killed during Pickett's charge. The second assistant, Keats Unthank, was the nephew of one of Morgan's raiders. The book reviewer, Jackson Rockingham, had been the youngest soldier in the Confederate Army, having appeared on the field of battle with a sword in one hand and a milk bottle in the other. The art editor, Roncesvalles Sykes, was a third cousin to a nephew of Jefferson Davis. Miss Lavinia Terhune, the colonel's stenographer and typewriter, had an aunt who had once been kissed by Stonewall Jackson. Tommy Webster, the head office boy, got his job by having recited Father Ryan's poems complete at the commencement exercises of the Toombs City High School. The girls who wrapped and addressed the magazines were members of old Southern families in reduced circumstances. The cashier was a scrub named Hawkins from Ann Arbor, Michigan, who had recommendations and a bond from a guarantee company filed with the owners. Even Georgia stock companies sometimes realize that it takes live ones to bury the dead. Well, sir, if you believe me, the Rose of Dixie blossomed 5 times before anybody heard of it, except the people who buy their hooks and eyes in Toombs City. Then Hawkins climbed off his stool and told on 'em to the stock company. Even in Ann Arbor he had been used to having his business propositions heard of at least as far away as Detroit. So an advertising manager was engaged, Beauregard Fitzhugh Banks, a young man in a lavender necktie, whose grandfather had been the exalted high pillow-slip of the Ku Klux Klan. In spite of which, the Rose of Dixie kept coming out every month, although in every issue it ran photos of either the Taj Mahal or the Luxembourg Gardens or Carmencita of La Follette. A certain number of people bought it and subscribed for it. As a boom for it, editor Colonel Telfair ran 3 different views of Andrew Jackson's old home, the Hermitage, a full-page engraving of the Second Battle of Manassas, entitled Lee to the Rear, and a 5,000-word biography of Belle Boyd in the same number. The subscription list that month advanced 118. Also, there were poems in the same issue by Leonina Vashti Harakat, pen name, related to the Harakats of Charleston, South Carolina, and Bill Thompson, nephew of one of the stockholders, and an article from a special society correspondent describing a tea party given by the swell Boston and English set, where a lot of tea was spilled overboard by some of the guests masquerading as Indians. One day a person whose breath would easily cloud a mirror, he was so much alive, entered the office of the Rose of Dixie. He was a man about the size of a real estate agent, with a self-tied tie and a manner that he must have borrowed conjointly from W. J. Bryan, Hackenschmidt, and Hetty Green. He was shown into the editor colonel's Ponce Asinorum. Colonel Telfair rose and began a Prince Albert bow. "I'm Thacker," said the intruder, taking the editor's chair. "T. Thacker of New York." He dribbled hastily upon the colonel's desk some cards, a bulky manila envelope, and a letter from the owners of the Rose of Dixie. This letter introduced Mr. Thacker, and politely requested Colonel Telfair to give him a conference and whatever information about the magazine he might desire. "I've been corresponding with the secretary of the magazine owners for some time," said Thacker briskly. "I am a practical magazine man myself, and a circulation booster as good as any, if I do say it. I'll guarantee an increase of anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000 a year for any publication that isn't printed in a dead language. I've had my eye on the Rose of Dixie ever since it started. I know every end of the business, from editing to setting up the classified ads. Now, I've come down here to put a good bunch of money in the magazine, if I can see my way clear. It ought to be made to pay. The secretary tells me it's losing money. I don't see why a magazine in the South, if it's properly handled, shouldn't get a good circulation in the North, too." Colonel Telfair leaned back in his chair and polished his gold-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Thacker," said he, courteously but firmly, "the Rose of Dixie is a publication devoted to the fostering and the voicing of Southern genius. Its watchword, which you may have seen on the cover, is of, for, and by the South." "But you wouldn't object to a Northern circulation, would you?" asked Thacker. "I suppose," said the editor colonel, "that it is customary to open the circulation lists to all. I do not know. I have nothing to do with the business affairs of the magazine. I was called upon to assume editorial control of it, and I have devoted to its conduct such poor literary talents as I may possess, and whatever store of erudition I may have acquired." "Sure," said Thacker, "but a dollar is a dollar anywhere, north, south, or west, whether you're buying codfish, goober peas, or Rocky Ford cantaloupes. Now, I've been looking over your November number. I see one here on your desk. You don't mind running over it with me? Well, your leading article is all right. A good write-up of the Cotton Belt with plenty of photographs is a winner any time. New York is always interested in the cotton crop. And this sensational account of the Hatfield-McCoy feud by a schoolmate of a niece of the governor of Kentucky isn't such a bad idea. It happened so long ago that most people have forgotten it. Now, here's a poem 3 pages long called The Tyrant's Foot by Lorella Lascelles. I've pawed around a good deal over manuscripts, but I never saw her name on a rejection slip." "Miss Lascelles," said the editor, "is one of our most widely recognized Southern poetesses. She is closely related to the Alabama Lascelles family, and made with her own hands the silken Confederate banner that was presented to the governor of that state at his inauguration." "But why," persisted Thacker, "is the poem illustrated with the view of the M&O Railroad freight depot at Tuscaloosa?" "The illustration," said the Colonel with dignity, "shows a corner of the fence surrounding the old homestead where Miss Marcellus was born." "All right," said Thacker. "I read the poem, but I couldn't tell whether it was about the depot of the Battle of Bull Run. Now, here's a short story called Rosie's Temptation by Fosdike Piggott. It's rotten. What is a Piggott, anyway?" "Mr. Piggott," said the editor, "is a brother of the principal stockholder of the magazine." "All's right with the world. Piggott passes," said Thacker. "Well, this article on Arctic exploration and the one on tarpon fishing might go, but how about this write-up of the Atlanta, New Orleans, Nashville, and Savannah breweries? It seems to consist mainly of statistics about their output and the quality of their beer. What's the chip over the bug?" "If I understand your figurative language," answered Colonel Telfair, "it is this. The article you refer to was handed to me by the owners of the magazine with instructions to publish it. The literary quality of it did not appeal to me, but in a measure I feel impelled to conform, in certain matters, to the wishes of the gentlemen who are interested in the financial side of the Rose." "I see," said Thacker. "Next we have 2 pages of selections from Lalla Rookh by Thomas More. Now, what federal prison did More escape from, or what's the name of the FFV family that he carries as a handicap?" "More was an Irish poet who died in 1852, said Colonel Telfair, pityingly. "He is a classic. I have been thinking of reprinting his translation of Anacreon serially in the magazine." "Look out for the copyright laws," said Thacker flippantly. "Who's Bessie Belclair, who contributes the essay on the newly completed waterworks plant in Milledgeville?" "The name, sir," said Colonel Telfair, "is the nom de guerre of Miss Elvira Simpkins. I have not the honor of knowing the lady, but her contribution was sent to us by Congressman Brower of her native state. Congressman Brower's mother was related to the Polks of Tennessee." "Now, see here, Colonel," said Thacker, throwing down the magazine, "this won't do. You can't successfully run a magazine for one particular section of the country. You've got to make a universal appeal. Now, look how the Northern publications have catered to the South and encouraged Southern writers. And you've got to go far and wide for your contributors. You've got to buy stuff according to its quality without any regard to the pedigree of the author. Now, I'll bet a quart of ink that this Southern parlor organ you've been running has never played a note that originated above the Mason and Hamlin's line. Am I right?" "I have carefully and conscientiously rejected all contributions from that section of the country, if I understand your figurative language aright," replied the Colonel. "All right, now I'll show you something." Thacker reached for his thick manila envelope and dumped a mass of typewritten manuscript on the editor's desk. "Here's some truck," said he, "that I paid cash for and brought along with me." One by one he folded back the manuscripts and showed the first pages to the Colonel. "Here are 4 stories by 4 of the highest priced authors in the United States, 3 of 'em living in New York and 1 commuting. There's a special article on Vienna Bread Society by Tom Vampson. Here's an Italian serial by Captain Jack. No, it's the other Crawford. Here are 3 separate exposés of city governments by Sniffings, and here's a dandy entitled What Women Carry in Dress Suitcases. A Chicago newspaper woman hired herself out for 5 years as a lady's maid to get that information. And here's a synopsis of preceding chapters of Hall Caine's new serial to appear next June. And here's a couple of pounds of vers de société that I got at a rate from the clever magazines. That's the stuff that people everywhere want. And now here's a write-up with photographs at the ages of 4, 12, 22, and 30 of George B. McClellan. It's a prognostication. He's bound to be elected mayor of New York. It'll make a big hit all over the country. I beg your pardon," said Colonel Telfair, stiffening in his chair. "What was the name?" "Oh, I see," said Thacker with a half grin. "Yes, he's a son of the general. We'll pass that manuscript up. But if you'll excuse me, Colonel, it's a magazine we're trying to make go of, not the first gun at Fort Sumter. Now, here's a thing that's bound to get next to you. It's an original poem by James Whitcomb Riley. J.W. himself. You know what that means to a magazine. I won't tell you what I had to pay for that poem, but I'll tell you this. Riley can make more money writing with a fountain pen than you or I with one that lets the ink run. I'll read you the last 2 stanzas. Pa lays around and loafs all day, and reads and makes us leave him be. He lets me do just like I please, and when I'm bad he laughs at me. And when I holler loud and say bad words and then begin to tease the cat, and Pa just smiles, Ma's mad and gives me Jessie crossed her knees. I always wondered why that was. I guess it's 'cause Pa never does. And after all the lights are out, I'm sorry about it. So I creep out of my trundle bed to Ma's and say I love her a whole heap, and kiss her, and I hug her tight, and it's too dark to see her eyes, but every time I do I know she cries and cries and cries and cries. I always wondered why that was. I guess it's 'cause Pa never does. That's the stuff, continued Thacker. What do you think of that? I am not unfamiliar with the works of Mr. Riley, said the Colonel deliberately. I believe he lives in Indiana. For the last 10 years I have been somewhat of a literary recluse, and am familiar with nearly all the books in the Cedar Heights Library. I am also of the opinion that a magazine should contain a certain amount of poetry. Many of the sweetest singers of the South have already contributed to the pages of The Rose of Dixie. I myself have thought of translating from the original for publication in its pages the works of the great Italian poet Tasso. Have you ever drunk from the fountain of this immortal poet's lines, Mr. Thacker? Not even a demi-Tasso, said Thacker. Now let's come to the point, Colonel Telfair. I've already invested some money in this as a flyer. That bunch of manuscripts cost me $4,000. My object was to try a number of them in the next issue. I believe you make up less than a month ahead, and see what effect it has on the circulation. I believe that by printing the best stuff we can get in the North, South, East, or West, we can make the magazine go. You have there the letter from the owning company asking you to cooperate with me in this plan. Let's chuck out some of this slush that you've been publishing, just because the writers are related to the Scoop Doodles of Scoop Doodle County. Are you with me? As long as I continue to be the editor of the Rose, said Colonel Telfair with dignity, I shall be its editor. But I desire also to conform to the wishes of its owners, if I can do so conscientiously. That's the talk, said Thacker briskly. Now, how much of this stuff I've brought can we get into the January number? We want to begin right away. There is yet space in the January number, said the editor, for about 8,000 words, roughly estimated. Great, said Thacker. It isn't much, but it'll give the readers some change from Goobers, Governors, and Gettysburg. I'll leave the selection of the stuff I brought to fill the space to you, as it's all good. I've got to run back to New York, and I'll be down again in a couple of weeks. Colonel Telfair slowly swung his eyeglasses by their broad black ribbon. The space in the January number that I referred to, said he, measuredly, has been held open purposely, pending a decision that I have not yet made. A short time ago a contribution was submitted to the Rose of Dixie that is one of the most remarkable literary efforts that has ever come under my observation. None but a mastermind and talent could have produced it. It would just fill the space that I have reserved for its possible use. Thacker looked anxious. What kind of stuff is it? He asked. 8,000 words sounds suspicious. The oldest families must have been collaborating. Is there going to be another secession? The author of the article, continued the Colonel, ignoring Thacker's allusions, is a writer of some reputation. He has also distinguished himself in other ways. I do not feel at liberty to reveal to you his name, at least not until I have decided whether or not to accept his contribution. Well, said Thacker nervously, is it a continued story, or an account of the unveiling of the new town pump in Whitmore, South Carolina, or a revised list of General Lee's body servants, or what? You are disposed to be facetious, said Colonel Telfair calmly. The article is from the pen of a thinker, a philosopher, a lover of mankind, a student and a rhetorician of high degree." "It must have been written by a syndicate," said Thacker. "But honestly, Colonel, you want to go slow. I don't know of any 8,000-word single doses of written matter that are read by anybody these days, except Supreme Court briefs and the reports of murder trials. You haven't by any accident gotten hold of a copy of one of Daniel Webster's speeches, have you?" Colonel Telfair swung a little in his chair and looked steadily from under his bushy eyebrows at the magazine promoter. "Mr. Thacker," he said gravely, "I am willing to segregate that somewhat crude expression of your sense of humor from the solicitude that your business investments undoubtedly have conferred upon you. But I must ask you to cease your jibes and derogatory comments upon the South and the Southern people. They, sir, will not be tolerated in the office of the Rose of Dixie for one moment. And before you proceed with more of your covert insinuations that I, the editor of this magazine, am not a competent judge of the merits of the matter submitted to its consideration, I beg that you will first present some evidence or proof that you are my superior in any way, shape, or form relative to the question in hand." "Oh, come, Colonel," said Thacker good-naturedly, "I didn't do anything like that to you. It sounds like an indictment by the Fourth Assistant Attorney General. Let's get back to business. What's this 8,000 to 1 shot about?" "The article," said Colonel Telfair, acknowledging the apology by a slight bow, "covers a wide area of knowledge. It takes up theories and questions that have puzzled the world for centuries, and disposes of them logically and concisely. One by one it holds up to view the evils of the world, points out the way of eradicating them, and then conscientiously and in detail commends the good. There is hardly a phase of human life that it does not discuss wisely, calmly, and equitably. The great policies of governments, the duties of private citizens, the obligations of home life, law, ethics, morality, all these important subjects are handled with a calm wisdom and confidence that I must confess has captured my admiration." "It must be a crackerjack," said Thacker, impressed. "It is a great contribution to the world's wisdom," said the colonel. "The only doubt remaining in my mind as to the tremendous advantage it would be to us to give it publication in the Rose of Dixie is that I have not yet sufficient information about the author to give his work publicity in our magazine." "I thought you said he is a distinguished man," said Thacker. "He is," replied the colonel, "both in literary and in other more diversified and extraneous fields. But I am extremely careful about the matter that I accept for publication. My contributors are people of unquestionable repute and connections, which fact can be verified at any time. As I said, I am holding this article until I can acquire more information about its author. I do not know whether I will publish it or not. If I decide against it, I shall be much pleased, Mr. Thacker, to substitute the matter that you are leaving with me in its place." Thacker was somewhat at sea. "I don't seem to gather," said he, "much about the gist of this inspired piece of literature. It sounds more like a dark horse than Pegasus to me." "It is a human document," said the colonel editor confidently, "from a man of great accomplishments, who, in my opinion, has obtained a stronger grasp on the world and its outcomes than that of any man living to-day." Thacker rose to his feet excitedly. "Say," he said, "it isn't possible that you've cornered John D. Rockefeller's memoirs, is it? Don't tell me that all at once." "No, sir," said Colonel Telfair. "I am speaking of mentality and literature, not of less worthy intricacies of trade." "Well, what's the trouble about running the article?" asked Thacker a little impatiently. "If the man's well known and has got the stuff." Colonel Telfair sighed. "Mr. Thacker," said he, "for once I have been tempted. Nothing has yet appeared in the Rose of Dixie that has not been from the pen of one of its sons or daughters. I know little about the author of this article, except that he has acquired prominence in a section of the country that has always been inimical to my heart and mind. but I recognize his genius, and as I have told you, I have instituted an investigation of his personality. Perhaps it will be futile, but I shall pursue the inquiry. Until that is finished, I must leave open the question of filling the vacant space in our January number." Thacker arose to leave. "All right, Colonel," he said, as cordially as he could. "You use your own judgment. If you've really got a scoop, or something that will make 'em sit up, run it instead of my stuff. I'll drop in again in about 2 weeks. Good luck." Colonel Telfair and the magazine promoter shook hands. Returning a fortnight later, Thacker dropped off a very rocky Pullman at Toombs City. He found the January number of the magazine made up and the forms closed. The vacant space that had been yawning for type was filled by an article that was headed thus: "Second Message to Congress, written for the Rose of Dixie by a member of the well-known Bullock family of Georgia, T. Roosevelt." End of The Rose of Dixie.